So how did politicians and the broadcaster get along in the 1960s? Well, the opening night of broadcasting, which was December the 31st, 1961, so it's New Year's Eve, basically 1961, wasn't perhaps the most auspicious beginning because one of the programs that was on the opening night was a speech basically by, at this stage, President Eamon de Valera, who spoke in broadcasting in sort of foreboding, or spoke of broadcasting in foreboding terms. And I think we can listen to his speech here.
I am privileged in being the first to address you on our new service, Television Éireann. I hope the service will provide for you all sources of recreation and pleasure, but also information, instruction, and knowledge. I must admit that sometimes when I think of television and radio and their immense power, I feel somewhat afraid. Like atomic energy, it can be used for incalculable good, but it can also do irreparable harm. Never before was there in the hands of man an instrument so powerful to influence the thoughts and actions of the multitude.
And we can see here that he regards broadcasting as a really significant threat, almost akin to kind of the threat of nuclear energy or kind of a atomic destruction. So not the most encouraging kind of beginning to the broadcaster. And this was sort of reflected in the tentative way that broadcasters in the 1960s and the state dealt with each other. You have the beginnings in the early 1960s of a very tentative, but relatively speaking, daring adoption of a new tone by broadcasters with regard to the state. And what's remarkable is that you get this sense, really for the first time, that the broadcaster sees its role as being, in political terms, to hold the state to account in some respect. And John Horgan makes the point that during the 1960s, there's a lack of any kind of effective political opposition in the Dáil. Fianna Fáil is absolutely dominant. And he suggests that to a certain extent, the broadcaster saw its role as being to play the role, if you like, of a kind of a political opposition. And Irish politicians weren't used to the idea that difficult questions coming from political interviewers on television, or on radio for that matter, didn't necessarily reflect the interviewer's own kind of personal perspective, but rather was a kind of was a result of kind of a professional kind of a standard, a professional way of asking politicians questions. And on a number of occasions in the early 1960s, Sean Lemass's Taoiseach privately intervened in an attempt to try and convince the RTE Director General to tone down the strength, I suppose, of the questions that were being directed towards, in particular, politicians representing Fianna Fáil and thus the government. The most dramatic conflict came in 1966 in the way that RTE covered a kind of a political controversy between the government on the one hand, the Minister for Agriculture, Charlie Haughey as it turns out, and the National Farmers Association, who were in dispute over some aspect of agricultural policy. After RTE had reported on an NFA march on Dublin and had juxtaposed comments from the leader of the NFA and Charlie Haughey, it appears that Charlie Haughey rang RTE directly to complain about the manner in which his speech had been put side by side with that of the leader of the NFA, and basically to demand that news bulletins be altered, which they subsequently were. Now, news of this leaked, I presume, from RTE and appeared in the newspapers in the following week. And it led to something of a kind of a public controversy about, the extent to which the state had a right to interfere with RTE. Because again, technically, if you wanted to make an instruction to RTE as the state, you could do so under Section 31, but you had to do so in writing, so it had to be public. It had to be, the intervention had to be obvious. In October 1966, in a bid to try and clarify his government's understanding of the state-broadcaster relationship, Lemass made what still seems like a fairly remarkable statement in the Dáil. Again, this is from October 1966, and let me quote it in full. Radio Telefís Éireann was set up in legislation as an instrument of public policy, and as such is responsible to the government. The government have overall responsibility for its conduct, and especially the obligation to ensure that its programmes do not offend against the public interest or conflict with national policy as defined in legislation. To this extent, the government reject the view that RTE should be, either generally or in regard to its current affairs and news programmes, completely independent of government supervision. And tensions would continue to develop over the course of the later 1960s. In 1967, the state intervened directly with RTE to prevent it sending a news and current affairs crew to report on the Vietnam War. And this appears to have been in a bid to avoid offending or potentially offending the US Embassy in Dublin. In a similar move in January 1968, it prevented RTE from sending a camera crew to Biafra, where there was a civil war ongoing at the time. In 1969, there was a major controversy around a 7 Days program. 7 Days was a news and current affairs show on RTE at this stage, which looked at illegal money lending, basically, in Dublin, and implicitly, at least, if not explicitly, criticised the Garda Síochána for failing, basically, to clamp down on the practice. The guards were, unsurprisingly, furious about this, and they put pressure on the government to basically clamp down on RTE in some way. And it was kind of bizarre result of this was that an inquiry, a government inquiry, was set up into not whether or not, in fact, the guards were doing enough to clamp out or to stamp down on illegal money lending, but rather on whether the program had demonstrated that there was a real problem or not. And part of the issue related to the fact that the program used some dramatic reconstruction of money lenders in operations. This is something that's actually very hard to actually film happening for obvious reasons, since it's an illegal activity. And the Commission of Inquiry into the program found that the program had breached some journalistic ethics. And in fact, that's open to question. But what was really striking was that the question was moved away from the responsibility of the guards in this respect. I suppose what it seemed to suggest was that where there was a possibility of a conflict between the broadcaster and some arm of the state as a whole was going to row in behind other aspects of the state. The state was not the only significant institution that felt somewhat discommoded by the arrival of this new and more independent broadcaster. The Catholic Church was also uncomfortable with the representations of Irish life, and indeed of life outside Ireland, from the UK and the US, that constituted so much of the early schedules of RTE. So in 1962, three bishops sought an audience with and secured an audience with Sean Lemass, basically to complain about the supposed lack of religious views of some of the broadcasters working in RTE. And there's a kind of a general sense that the church seeks to have some kind of influence within the editorial level of RTE in the early 1960s. To their credit, on this particular score, the state basically held fast, and Lemass made it gently but firmly clear that RTE would not be, made subservient, if you like, to the interests of the Catholic Church in Ireland, albeit it's not as if it was a kind of a religiously radical institution by any means. Like if you take for example the omnipresence of the Angelus as part of the broadcasting schedule going back to the 1950s, it was kind of clear that there were certain sort of signifiers of Catholicism built into the broadcasting station, and arguably still are. But it's outside the areas of explicit religious broadcasting that the greatest, I suppose, tensions emerge between the broadcaster and between the church. And one, significant conduit for this is the Late Late Show, which starts as a filler program. It was only meant to run for the summer months in 1962. And between 1962 and 1999 was presented by one figure, a remarkably skilled broadcaster called Gay Byrne, who would also have a very popular radio show on RTE1 from the 1970s through until the start, in fact, of the 21st century. And what's really remarkable, I suppose, about the Late Late Show, in a way that it doesn't really reflect its function in the 21st century, was how in the 1960s it became a venue for the exploration of ideas and subject matters that simply had not been talked about in Irish society before. And we're talking about various social taboos, amongst which simply talking about sex was perhaps, I suppose, its most remarkable transformation of the nature of public discourse in Ireland. But it's not just sex. It also talked about politics in a way that hadn't been talked about before. Politicians were nervous about the kind of the unscripted nature of the Late Late Show, but it had a huge audience, so it was very hard to resist the lure of going on. But I mean, the example of religious tensions are probably exemplified by an incident in 1966, frequently referred to as the incident of the Bishop and the Nighty, where Gay Byrne, I think the background was that a guest had failed to turn up and they had to basically make up a segment at short notice. They decided to do a sort of an off-the-cuff Mr. and Mrs. segment. So they got on uni-married couples and asked them questions about each other. One of the questions, this seems so innocent from the perspective of the 21st century. One of the questions that was asked of a wife was what the colour of her nightie had been on the night she'd gotten married. And her response to that was that she couldn't remember. And then she sort of giggled and said, I might not have worn anything at all.
There was no mailman outside. No, there was no mail. Were you all right out there? No one said a word to you? No, that's all right. Don't worry about it. Now, I want you to ask you the same questions. I want you to give me the answer. If money were no object, we asked your husband, would you choose as a holiday A, a trip to Spain, B, a cruise on the Shannon, or C, 2 weeks in New York?
Cruise on the Shannon.
Splendid. We then asked him where you first feel the cold. Was it A, your nose, B, your feet, or C, some other place?
My feet.
We then asked him what colour was your honeymoon nightie. Was it A, white, was it B, black, and C, was it some other colour? And for heaven's sake, watch every word you say. What? She didn't wear any.
This was met by public excoriation from at least one bishop, saying that basically the Late Late Show had descended to the level of utter smut, bringing this to kind of into Irish homes every Saturday night. And it's not just on the Late Late Show that you see these questioning and explorations of kind of assumptions about how Irish society was examined. You had soap operas, you had the Reardons set in kind of a rural context, and Tulka Row emerging in the 1960s, which begin to explore and I suppose question some of the basic assumptions about the way that Irish society was organised. But perhaps the subject which brings state and broadcaster relations most sharply into relief is the question of the coverage of Northern Ireland in the late 1960s and in particular in the early 1970s. Northern Ireland basically explodes, I mean sometimes literally, from about 1968 onwards. You have the Catholic Civil Rights Movement beginning in 1968, which is violently resisted by kind of arms of the British state in Northern Ireland. You have the emergence of loyalist paramilitary forces from 1969. You have the re-establishment on the Republican side of the IRA as the provisional IRA. You have various splits within the IRA between a kind of a military wing and a more politically oriented wing. And in reality, RTE was just not ready for this. Dublin as a whole, kind of Irish politicians, had not seen this coming. And it's kind of striking that at the end of the 1960s, RTE didn't even have a Belfast office. It was just sort of seen, it was literally seen as another country, a very distant geographical setting. And I suppose there's a period where the Irish state is flailing somewhat with regard to what's happening up there. I mean, it's illustrated by what's sometimes referred to as the arms crisis in 1970, when it emerged that two members of the Fianna Fáil cabinet may or may not have been involved in an attempt to illegally smuggle arms to the IRA so they could prosecute a war essentially against the British state. Now, both members of cabinet, although they were dismissed from the cabinet, would later be they weren't convicted in a court of law. But it demonstrated the kind of the sense of crisis, I suppose, that was pervading Irish politics at the time. And there was a question, of course, of how should RTE cover this. In June 1971, the then Taoiseach, Jack Lynch, expressed the clear view that it would be unsuitable to use a publicly funded broadcaster to interview members, essentially, of proscribed organisations, of illegal organisations, i.e. The IRA. RTE's response to this was that they would only amend a programme in such a way if they received a written instruction under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. On the 28th of September 1971, there was a kind of a test case of how this would actually pan out. 7 days carried an interview with leading members of two wings of the IRA, the military wing and the more kind of political wing. And this led to a response from the Minister for Posts and Telegraphs, Gerry Collins.
Last Friday, the Minister for Posts and Telegraphs issued a direction in writing to the RTE authority to refrain from broadcasting any matter of the following class. That is, any matter that could be calculated to promote the aims or activities of any organisation which engages in, promotes, encourages or advocates the attaining of any particular objective by violent means. Now, we know from the Taoiseach's speech in Cork on the following evening that this direction was not made suddenly, but the fact that two leaders of the IRA were interviewed on this programme on the previous Tuesday did seem to loom large in Mr Lynch's considerations. The RTE authority's reply confirmed receipt of the direction and recognised the authority's statutory obligation to present objectively and impartially news or features relating to matters of public controversy. They believe that in the present difficult national situation, they would be failing in that duty if they ignored the existence of any significant development in the community, legal or illegal.
RTE complained that the wording of the directive was somewhat ambiguous. I mean, technically, an organisation which engages in a political objective by violent means could potentially include an army, could potentially include the Guards. But it also meant that RTE technically couldn't talk to other, paramilitary organisations in other countries. It meant that they couldn't talk to the African National Congress, for example, in South Africa. So RTE sought clarification of exactly who they could and could not speak to. But they didn't get it. The state basically refused to do so and simply referred them back to the original order. Things finally come to a head in November 1972. In that month, an RTE reporter called Kevin O'Kelly put together a radio report based on an interview with a member of the IRA, a guy called Sean McStiffon, although Sean McStiffon is not mentioned by name in this report. The government was furious and said, what happened here? And RTE's response was that although this, yes, was probably a lapse of editorial judgment, that it was essentially an internal matter and the state didn't need to worry about it. The state disagreed. On November 24th, 1972, they simply fired the RTE authority outright and replaced them overnight with an entirely new authority. And this occurred without any reference to the Dáil or seeking anyone else's approval. In effect, actually, Gerry Collins was able to do this by himself. And it was a very clear statement on the part of the state of how they understood their authority, their power relative to the broadcaster.